Thanks very much. And thanks for those great introductions. I should first of all say that Going with the Grain is not yet a book. It still exists merely as an article. And there's also a sort of Going with the Grain Redux, which is about to come out in a volume produced by Routledge. But it's not yet a book, so don't get your hopes up. What I'm going to do in this talk, I'm going to first of all give an overview of the article, which is in this special anniversary issue, and then I'm going to talk a bit about recent research we've been doing and what light that has thrown onto the original thesis. The piece was intended really with two purposes in mind. The first one was to really set out the APP stall, the Africa Power and Politics Programme stall, and bring it to a wider audience. And the second one was to, think through some aspects of our own research focus which weren't completely nailed down. And I think from its inception, the APP was inspired by a hunch, really, that the good governance agenda in Africa was having disappointing results because it was working at cross purposes with existing social, cultural and political realities. And so we adopted from this the idea that development policy would be better if it went with the grain of those existing realities. So this prompts the question of what exactly do we mean by the grain, or what is the grain? And to some extent, of course, it's only a metaphor, but it's good to try and flesh that metaphor out. So I defined it in this piece as patterns of thought, organisation and accountability in Africa that have been both widely distributed in space and durable across time. And in particular, I argued that there was a pre-colonial political cultural pattern or complex which continued to be terrifically powerful in Africa today. And this complex or pattern consisted really of a big man, a strong man, be it the head of a household or a chief or a king, manipulating the spiritual and the material realms in order to bring health and prosperity to his followers, who were thought of as members of his own extended family. Now, often in Africa, this pattern was associated with a whole range of anti-developmental phenomena, so patrimonialism, clientelism, authoritarianism, corruption, patriarchy, irrationalism, and so on. But I argued that we didn't have to think about this complex in that way. And instead we should be thinking about ways in which this pattern could be harnessed for the purposes of development. So the idea, as I think the language I used in the article, was how to build on extant notions of moral obligation and interpersonal accountability in ways that are developmental rather than predatory. So I argued that, as I say, elements of this pattern could be potential resources for development, and they need not be thought of as obstacles. And I gave a number of examples of this. So I'm going to talk about the extended family and ethnicity, about religion and the spiritual realm, and also about this phenomenon of big man or strong man rule. And I argued that when it came to the extended family and ethnicity, you could already find in Africa examples of where this was having a developmental effect. So, for instance, in somewhere like Somaliland, you find that natural resources, rangelands, tend to be governed and also conserved quite effectively by indigenous clan structures. In places like Benin and Nigeria, you find that the extended family and the ethnic group forms the framework for business networks, which can be quite effective. And in places like Tanzania and Cameroon, you find that ethnic hometown associations are driving development in a variety of spheres, from school provision to road building. And what you tend to find in all these areas is that these institutions, associated as they are with the extended family, seem to be able to elicit a greater degree of moral and practical commitment from their members than do modern organisations like the state or like NGOs. Now, the same could be said when it comes to religious organisations as well. All over Africa, religious organisations, churches and mosques are often superior suppliers of social services, in particular education and health. And again, I argued that this was because members of these organisations feel themselves to be accountable to a higher power and to be rooted in a tradition that spans several centuries. Even if these are modern churches and mosques, nevertheless, they cohere in some ways with older religious traditions and older religious institutions. I also argued that the supernatural could be a source of accountability in government, and that it was being used in some areas to discipline behaviour and discipline leaders, and that although witchcraft in many instances was a very sort of anti-developmental force, there were some positive sides of it. And then I also talked about big man rule, and I talked about institutions such as chieftaincy, which in many areas in Africa seem to be fulfilling a developmental role in terms of providing security, providing justice services, organising certain aspects of collective action, for instance, road maintenance and bush clearing. And although chiefs did not have legitimacy right across the continent, there were some chiefs which lacked traditional legitimacy and were quite ineffective. Nevertheless, traditional leaders were a potential source or a potential focus for development activities, which was, I argued, probably underutilised. And I also argued that if you take the chief as a sort of prototype for the presidential political strongman, then you could also find some examples of how this authoritarian rule, which so often is stigmatized as being anti-developmental, can actually have some developmental effects, especially in the fields of anti-corruption and development planning. I'll come on to that a bit later. So those were all some examples of what I called working with the grain, which I think had considerable developmental potential. Now, this piece generated quite quickly a number of reactions, not least from within the Africa Power and Politics programme itself. And some of those reactions were positive, and quite a lot of them were negative. Various people asked, well, isn't this thesis just propping up patriarchy? Or doesn't it have a very unnuanced notion of what African tradition is? Isn't it dangerous to regard ethnicity as a force for positive change? And so forth. I mean, I can come to those in questions later on, but I won't address them here. But I'll say that I think one of the more interesting criticisms was to ask why do we think that the distant past is more likely to be a source of developmental institutions than the present? You know, what is it about the past which seems to be important for institutions? And this caused us to do a bit more reading and a bit more thinking, and I think there are at least 3 reasons for that. One of them is to do with risk. So when you're faced with thinking about what kinds of institutions you want to order your society, introducing entirely new institutions which are as yet unproven is extremely risky. So it's a low risk, a risk-averse policy to stick with institutions that you know and simply adapt them, and to try out the kinds of new institutions which are often promoted, for instance, by the governance agenda. Secondly, it's about cost in new institutional terms. So, the costs of adapting old institutions are much lower often than the costs of importing entirely new ones. partly because if you bring in entirely new institutions, you have to teach people how to use them, how to work with them. And that often takes a long time because these institutions are unfamiliar. So it's about familiarity and costs. And the third one, I think, is about legitimacy or thinkability. I think people often are more comfortable with institutions with which they're familiar with, and even innovations become more legitimate when they're couched in terms that people already understand. So this idea of thinkability is a term used by Michael Schatzberg to explain why it is that patriarchy just keeps on cropping up in African politics time and time again. It's not just about issues of raw power, it's about issues of thinkability, what people at what he calls a subjacent level believe to be the proper order of things. Now that's not to say that these things can't change and evolve, but it is to say that it's easier perhaps to adapt them than it is to replace them entirely. So all of these are reasons, I think, why not all of the developmental institutions we find in Africa will be rooted in the past, and not all the solutions to African development will be found there. But I think a significant proportion of those institutions will have identifiable links with the past, which may be real, empirical, they may be fictive, or they may be of a sort of a family resemblance type. So an institution is actually quite new, but it looks and feels like something that existed in the past. So what has the APP actually found out in the past 2 or 3 years? 3 years, I suppose, that we've been working on this, coming up to 4. Well, the APP has had a variety of streams. There's a stream on business and politics that I'm involved in. There's another one on cotton reforms. There's another one on religious education in the Sahel. There's a big stream on local governance in several different African countries. There's a stream on bureaucracies, and in particular looking at forestry, resources. Anything that I haven't mentioned, David? I think those are the main ones. And I think we're still sort of synthesizing the results, and there's more data to come. But if we try to generalize from the diverse findings that we've received, I think we can say that public goods in Africa are more successfully provided when one or more of 3 things happen. And the first one is that elements of big man rule, strong man rule, are combined with sound technical advice and vertical performance disciplines. Secondly, where what we call practical hybrids combine elements of African tradition with modern politics. With modern practices.
You say that one again? I missed that one.
Where practical hybrids combine elements of African tradition with modern practices. And thirdly, where development solutions are what we call locally anchored. In other words, they build on pre-existing institutions to solve locally defined collective action problems. So I'm going to give you one example from each of those categories. The first one stems from business and politics research. We looked at 23 regimes across 7 countries in Africa from independence to the present day, looking at modes of governance and economic performance. And we found that of those 23 regimes, 4 of them had achieved actually strong economic performance for periods of upwards of a decade. We also found that, like many of the other regimes, those regimes had a neo-patrimonial structure. So they were governed by big men, often founding fathers of their nations. They had single party or dominant party systems. They didn't conform to good governance recommendations. However, what differentiated these regimes from the less well-performing ones was that they were able to combine this mode of strongman governance with what we call technocratic integrity. That is a competent and confident economic technocracy which was subject to top-down vertical performance disciplines. Where these factors were in place, we found that economic performance was considerably better. I'm going to talk about that at length this afternoon.
What are vertical performance disciplines?
Well, for instance, you have a strong man, a political leader who is dedicated to economic growth, and either he himself or his network is monitoring the activities of civil servants, setting targets, and disciplining staff who are not fulfilling those targets, or disciplining staff who are engaged in corruption or maladministration in developmentally damaging ways. That doesn't mean that there's no corruption. Often there is quite a lot of corruption, but it's corruption which is steered towards economic growth and better economic performance, rather than the more parasitic forms. Okay, my second example is about maternal mortality in Rwanda. In our research in a particular district in Rwanda, Nyamagabe district, we found that there's been a massive increase in the number of women attending prenatal checkups at health centres and also giving birth in health centres. And this has led to a considerable reduction in the rates of maternal mortality. And there are a variety of reasons for this, but one of the factors driving this is a performance-based contract which members of the local administration take in Rwanda, which is based on a traditional pre-colonial oath called the imihigo, which warriors used to swear to the Rwandan king. So this is a mechanism of accountability. Again, it's a form of sort of top-down vertical accountability which links people in the district to high political structures and which holds them to account. And people are very eager to make sure that targets are fulfilled, that people are attending health centres. It's quite authoritarian, it's quite disciplinarian, but the results are there to be seen. And my third example is of town chiefs in Malawi. In many parts of Malawi, an institution or a phenomenon known as town chiefs has arisen in urban areas in response to the lack of traditional authority and to the weakness of local government. And these town chiefs are often involved in providing security functions, justice functions, reconciliation services, things like funeral services. In some instances, they're helping to maintain roads and so forth. And town chiefs, we say, are locally anchored for a variety of reasons, but one of the most important is that they seem to bring a resonant template of traditional authority from the rural setting into a non-traditional urban setting and make it work for modern purposes. So I'm running out of time, so I'll begin my conclusions, but what I would say about all of these examples is that I think that they all do to some extent draw upon this pre-colonial grain which we have identified. However, it would be a mistake to think that these institutions are purely traditional. Certainly not, and indeed they all include elements that are not quintessentially traditional or quote-unquote African at all. So there's nothing particularly traditional about, securing macroeconomic stability or balancing your budget, when you're running a developmental neo-patrimonial state. There's nothing particularly traditional about the kinds of health interventions which mothers receive in Rwandan health clinics. And indeed, traditional birth attendants were initially a part of this scheme. They were encouraged to participate, but later on they were phased out completely. And thirdly, when it comes to town chiefs, yes, they do draw on a resonant template of traditional authority, but they are in a multi-ethnic setting. They are often actually elected rather than chosen on a hereditary basis. So there are definite modern aspects to this practice. So I think that the lesson of the studies that we've done is that it's about really combining old and new elements in developmentally efficacious ways. And I think I'll stop there. I could talk about what the policy implications are, but maybe that will come out in the discussion. So
Thank you.